today's session that we will be having on Microsoft Graph API. Thank you all for making time for this session and joining in. So if we talk about the traditional IT workflow, before we start with understanding what Graph API is, we need to know what is the business use case of Graph API. So I won't be able to speak about all the business use case, but I will be just trying to show you one of the use cases here to understand that. So on the IT perspective, uh, when user needs a request an app that requires an approval, so that may be an application that requires a license like a Visio or a project thing. Most of the organizations have a ITSM tool in place like ServiceNow, which is the most popular, and ServiceNow has the app catalog which the user can use to request an application that requires an approval. So what the user does is makes request for an app via the ServiceNow catalog, which creates a ticket, a snow ticket. A ticket will have tasks. So one of the tasks would be an approval task that gets sent to the approver. The approver once approves that task, the task is completed, which triggers another task, which is the actual task uh, that will actually make the user get the app available to him or her. So this task gets assigned to the service desk as a ticket in the queue, and the service desk makes the user a member of the required group for which the application becomes available to the end user. The task is marked complete and the ticket gets closed. That is how the traditional IT workflow is. So if for an example here I say like I have 100 users in my example organization where 20 of the application requires an approval, 100 of the users will be generating 20 of those requests. So you get the number. So those many tickets will be coming to the service desk. What if we can automate that? And that is exactly what we will see in this flow where user needs the app. The flow remains same. User makes a request via the Snow app catalog. A ticket gets created. There is the same approval task that goes to the approver. The approver approves the task, which creates the second task, which is to add the user to the required group to make the app available. But in the traditional IT flow, we see this task is getting assigned to the service desk. But here, what we will see is like Snow is capable enough to trigger the group membership change in Microsoft 365 Cloud or whatever identity system that you are using. It does not has to be Microsoft 365, but since we are talking about Microsoft Graph API, so like we are talking about the Microsoft Cloud in general. And what it does is Snow adds the user to the required group in Azure AD. The app becomes available to the end user. The task is completed based on the response of that response that it receives from Microsoft 365 Cloud, and the ticket gets closed. This is a general business use case of an automation saving help desk calls or tickets, reducing cost. And this is where we talk about Graph API. So how ServiceNow is communicating with the Microsoft 365 Cloud is where Microsoft Graph comes in. Uh, so what is Microsoft Graph? If I tell it's basically a RESTful API that acts as a gateway to the M365. It's it establishes a relation between the resources. The resources can be users, the resources can be device, the resources can be groups, the resource can be anything that makes up the M365 cloud component. It can be an Exchange Online component like a mailbox, a contact, a calendar. It can be a Microsoft Teams object like a Teams channel and things like that. And you have access to everything that makes up the Microsoft 365 cloud using simple API calls. This is a REST based protocol. Uh, and That is also, it helps you to automate workflows, it helps you to perform bulk actions which are not otherwise possible via the standard portals that we work on as admins. Uh, if we talk about protocols, then yes, it's a REST protocol, or it's a RESTful API, so it's based on the REST structure. Now, what is REST is represented. I forgot that. It's I think representable state transfer. REST API is a thing, and there are two types of APIs basically. So one is SOAP and one is REST. Uh, SOAP is like a more structured oriented where you need to follow a strict pattern, whereas REST is more flexible. It lets you work with HTTP queries like get, post, put, and things like that. It's heavily based on the open data protocol, and it uses the JSON as its messaging structure. So when I say what is JSON as a messaging structure, whenever we are sending any HTTP things like the communications that is happening, uh, HTTP calls, there is a request response pattern. So like I am doing something from my here, or I am connecting from the Internet Explorer when I'm trying to access Microsoft, say maybe the Intune portal. It's a HTTP request going to the endpoint, and a response is coming back, right? So that makes the HTTP thing, and there is a header defined, there is a HTTP body. Now everything in this, the data that is contained in that communication call is in the format of a JSON. So that is what Microsoft Graph is, and why it is like said as a gateway to the Microsoft Cloud. If you say, we as admin work using the portals, like the different portals. If you are a SharePoint admin, you would be working with the SharePoint portal. If you are an Exchange admin, you would be working with the Exchange thing. And there are so many portals with the Microsoft things. But the problem comes is whenever there is a task that overlaps from one portal to another portal where I have to move switch portals to get the job done, it becomes very inefficient. If especially that is a bulk job, that is where Microsoft Graph comes in. It lets you, like, there is no portal, there is no more portal concept in the graph. It's the entire Microsoft 365 cloud that is accessible to you via a single endpoint, that is graph.microsoft.com. You have those four actions: get, post, put, delete. There is a fifth one as well, patch, but not used that much. uh, and then you get the response. So it's a single endpoint to interact with the entire cloud, and that is why also it is called an API, application programming interface, an interface that lets you connect and communicate with the Microsoft 365 cloud. Uh, Now when I say, if you remember, like in this thing, in this slide I talked about like Microsoft Graph establishes a relationship between the resources, forming a graph like structure. So how it does that is, in this slide you will see. Let's take the example of a user. Now when I talk about a user, it's an object. In the high level view, a user is an object. An object will have its entities, like test user 1, test user 2, test user 3, and each of those entities will have their own parameters to identify themselves. So there will be display name for a user, a GUID, user principal name, department, country, licenses, member of, and all those things. How to access one of those entities is like you will go to graph.microsoft.com, whatever the version 1 or beta. You will put the users as the object or the resource type, and slash then that particular GUID or UPN to access that resource. So this is how we are talking about a single resource type, that is user. Now when we consider about another resource type, say groups, this is where the relationship comes in, because the group resource will also have its entity like group 1, group 2, and one of the entities of the user resource type may be a member of group 1 or a member of group 2, right? And this is where how the relationship comes on. So you see, the URL remains the same, it's same graph.microsoft.com, and now you are talking about when we go into this, you are just adding into the parameters of that, and you are accessing the further resource. So you, when you are doing like user slash particular user and a member of, you are accessing the group. So similarly, like maybe now this part, users and groups, maybe I can take in terms of portal, I will take it into the Azure AD portal that I control with. Coming into managed devices, Intune, say the Microsoft Endpoint Management or admin portal, we have managed devices. Now a user may have devices enrolled as well, and similarly the devices will have their own entities and properties. This is where the user relationship comes in with the devices, and same like there will be exchange things and entities, and all it forms is a relation of graph. And this is how you establish a graph API thing. And basically like it's the backend driver of whatever we are also doing in the portals is actually getting implemented in the backend via graph API, because the admin portals that we are working on are basically the front ends made up of HTML, CSS and all those things. But the actions, like when we are setting a policy, we are creating something, we are clicking on that save button, what is happening in the backend is a graph API call that is being triggered. So initially when we are beginning with to start using graph API, and we don't know what resource or what endpoint to make the request to, you can make use of the F12 browser tracing or the browser developer tool to quickly check what graph API call the portal is making when you do that particular action, and then you would be able to use that same query. Obviously you would have to remove the GUIDs and things, make it a standardized or generalized form, and use it in your script or program, whatever you are using with it. But when we talk about Microsoft Graph API or anything related to Microsoft 365, the first and the most important thing that comes is the authentication and the authorization. This is one of the most critical aspects of working with M365 Cloud or the Microsoft identity. So here you can see this structure is basically uh, what the real life scenario is. You will have a client that can be made up of any solution or any development platform. It can be based on Windows, it can be based on iOS, Android, it can be a web app made of anything that you are comfortable with. And then you will have the server side, which is the Microsoft 365. But in order for the client and server to communicate within each other to make everything happen, there is a component in between that comes in as the authentication and authorization, which is facilitated by the Microsoft Identity Platform, which is the Microsoft Authentication Library, the MSAL platform, which makes use of the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect primarily. It also supports SAML and ADFS federations, obviously. But primarily it works on OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. So Microsoft Graph does not introduces a new thing in the identity. It reuses what is already there in the Microsoft Cloud. So you have your Azure AD identity. It works on the same thing, the Microsoft Identity Service Stack. So it works on the same principles of requiring an ID token, access token, and with that access token, it can go and grab the resource that it's trying to do. Now, why an access token is required? Because obviously you cannot access a service without a proper uh, permissions, right? We won't want anyone to just log into the portal and get access to doing things. So it's the same thing with Graph API as well. And because it is overtly powerful, there is no portal you can make the calls using PowerShells or your app. You would want to be very secured about it, and that is where the access token comes in. The access token, it contains the informations as below, like it mentions the token issuer, who issued the token, what time the token was issued at, what is the validity of the token, the application details that you are working with for the resource. So here it mentions the graph API because that is what we will be working for. But in general, say for example, you are working with Exchange Online, then the application details you are working with Exchange Online will be the details there. The identity type, like it is a user that is signing in or it is an application that is signing in. So an application can run with a signed in user. An application can run without a signed in user as well. Then the details of the user, if it is a user type authentication, and the permissions that are consented for the app. Now, why this access token is required? Because without having this access token, Microsoft Identity Platform won't let the caller, which is triggering the call, to get access to the resource. So for Microsoft Graph, every resource is treated as a secured entity, and as such a permission is required to be granted for that particular thing to be accessed. Because if we try to run a query without having the proper permissions, it will always result in an error that you can see request authorization failed. So you don't have the access to resource the particular resource type. So if we understand this thing is what actually happens for an application that when we are working with Microsoft Graph or any application, to be honest, that is implementing the Microsoft identity stack. It can be a PowerShell script as well. So end user signs into the application or the application can authenticate on its own identity without any user sign in. uh, Request is sent to the auth endpoint. The auth endpoint is nothing but the Microsoft identity, that is the login.microsoftonline.com, with the requested permissions. The user is displayed a sign in page where the user will perform the signing. If the app is doing a sign in without any user, then there is no such login window displayed, and there will be a particular screen where you will be asked to consent for the permissions that the application is seeking. Like this application requests permission to access users, groups, and things like this, what we normally see in our mobiles as well. And if the authentication is successful, the identity endpoint will send a JWT token, a Java Web Token, to the application, which is basically a bearer token which will contain the access token. And with that, the application can now perform its activities, like it can make the API calls, it can access the resources and do whatever it was programmed for. Now, this is true not only for Microsoft Graph API that I am telling, this is true for every and any application that is working with the Microsoft Identity Platform. When we talk particularly about Microsoft Graph, there are two types of permissions that we get to work with. One is delegated permissions, means it requires a signed in users. The permissions are assigned to the user, not to the application. And then there is the application permissions where there is no signed in user required. The permissions are directly assigned to the applications. Now these two permissions are directly applicable to the two use cases of automation. One is when we as an IT admin are automating workflows, or there is a requirement for audit where we want to know which identity has performed which action or activity on the service. We will be using a delegated permission because we want the script to run in with a signed in account. That can be a service account, that can be an admin account, whatever that be. But when there is an automation which will not let us use a signed in user, say for example the first example that we talked about, ServiceNow communicating with the Microsoft 365 cloud to trigger group membership changes for a user. Now ServiceNow, when communicating with Microsoft 365 cannot show you a authentication prompt because it is a service to service communication. There is no application involved. So it needs to be a non-interactive authentication session. Means ServiceNow will act as a daemon. Means a daemon you can say is a small web application which makes an integration like a service to service integration thing kind of thing. And in such cases, you got to work with the application permissions. Now, these two types of permissions has a direct connection with the effective permission that is happening. So for delegated type permission, the effective permission is always like it can never be more than what permission the user has. So for example, like if I assign the delegated permission of user read write all, but me myself I'm trying to sign in, I am just a standard user, I do not have any user admin roles provided to me. The effective permission for me will be user read write only, it will not be user read write all. That is where the inclusion comes in. So the effective permission can never exceed the permission that the user has, even if I have given that. But for application permission, if I give user read write all, means the application will have access to all the user objects. It can read, write, update, do anything with the user objects that are there in the cloud. So we need to be very careful when we are working with the permissions and providing permissions, because you won't want a security risk in the environment, right? So with this, all this was basically like pre-fundamental things about working with graph. So now let's start talking about how to work with the graph. So this is how the portal looks like. So you have a sign in button where you need to sign in. Then this is where you choose your HTTP methods. I will give you a show of the portal as well, but this is for a quick identification. This point 3 is where you define the version. So Graph API has two versions, version 1 and beta. Version 1 is the production thing and beta is the testing thing, but most of the things work in beta only. Production version has a less feature, but again, as Microsoft recommends not to use the beta version for production environments. This is the space where you build your query, and this is the button to run the query. This is where you can define your request body and request header, the HTTP header that I was talking about. And this is where you will get the response back, the HTTP response. And this is where you can see a history of your queries that you have run, or Graph Explorer as a tool will also give you sample queries that you can start with. So if this is the first time that you will be trying out or starting with using Microsoft Graph API, then Graph Explorer should be this tool to begin with. It's a developer sandbox and it lets you fire actual things. So this is when we talk about sandbox means we are running something virtually, but yes, this is a sandbox, but whatever you do here will get affected on the tenant in real time. So this is a real time sandbox, not a virtual sandbox. I will give you a demo of the Graph Explorer portal, showing you how to run the different types of queries. But before that, we need to know how the structure of a Graph API query looks like. So every Graph API query must follow a standard pattern, which is shown here. It should define the HTTP method. It should define the version of the graph that is you are going to work with, whether it will be V1 or beta, the resource type that you want this particular query to work on, like it's users, groups, managed device, whatever that be. And last, optionally, you can also use query parameters because Microsoft Graph API is based on OData. open data, so it supports OData query parameters, which you can use for filtering purposes. So this is how you can run one query, but we will quickly like close this PowerPoint session here and move on to see some examples. So I am already signed in first on this thing, so you can see that signed in. But now if you get a look into the current access token that I have, you have this button here, it will get the access token. Now this is the access token that you have, so this is base 64 encoded. You won't get a sense of it. If you want to see that live, you can use a JWT JSON Web Token, something like this, a debugger, and you can just paste in that token in here. And you can see the details of the tokens. So this is the header, but it's not interesting. What interesting is the payload. So here you will see like the thing. It is the Graph Explorer official site. I am the user that is signing in. ID type is user. This is the name of the user who signed in. And what's more important for us to know is the permissions. What permissions currently this access token has. So these are all the permissions that the access token has. This is how you review access tokens when you are getting something like a authorization failed error. But this is like I have already signed in, right? So you don't know how to add permissions. So if you want to add more permissions, for example, you are working with a resource type that requires a permission that is not already added into it here. So what you will do is you click on this small cog sign here, you go into select permissions, and from here you can select or get the list of permissions that are there. So Graph API, it only works with user sign in, so it works with delegated permissions. There is no application permission in here. Whatever you need, you can just choose that particular thing, and you can add that, like you can select and you can click on consent. Now there is one thing that you will see here. One more interesting thing is that this particular column which shows that admin consent is required. Admin consent is required means if those permissions which have this ticked, if you add these permissions to here, someone with the global admin role or cloud application admin role or an application administrator role has to provide the consent that this request can be used by the application before you as an user would be able to use that. So when you click on consent, it will go into launch a small sign-in window like this. Wait, why? Uh, let's use another account, but why is this stop? Wait. Any idea how I can bring that down? Okay. So this is how you get the consent window where it says that this particular application requesting access for this particular permissions. So would you want to do or accept those? Now, if you are a global admin, like in this case, this particular user is a global admin. So it also shows me this particular box where it asks me to consent on behalf of the organization. What this means is like once I have consented to this, if any other user is will be using this application from my tenant, they won't be offered this window again because the applications are already consented by the global admin. If the global admin has not consented for the on behalf of organization, like every user sign in will be prompted to first accept the permissions, and once you do that, you will get a new access token with the new permissions that you selected. So this is one important thing. So if you already have a access token and you then go ahead and add or modify the permissions that your application is already having, you have to re-authenticate to get the new access token, because the previous access token would not have that modified permissions added to it. And the validity of access token is 1 hour. So you will, if you do not re-authenticate proactively, you will have to wait out for 1 hour for that access token to expire, when the application will automatically try to renew the token with a refresh token it has. And with that, let's say if I want to grab the details of a user, so these are the methods that I get, the HTTP standard methods. This is the version, how I choose the version. And if I go into this, then this is basically the resource that I would be typing. Now, if I say I am running this query for the users, it will give me all the users. It will give me the list of all the users. And the response you see, this is a JSON response with a OData parameter. This is what the response looks like. But say if I want to get a particular user, then that would be like this. You can do it with the UPN, because UPN is a unique parameter of an entity, or you can do it with the GUID. GUID is also a unique parameter for an entity. And you do that, you can get like this, and it will only show you the details for this particular user, no other user. And you can also, like, the response, it's giving a full response. If you don't want all the details but only would want to know a few particular things, then you can do something like this, where dollar select equals to, like, say maybe I would want to know the country of this user. So if I run this, it will give me, so it does not exist for one of the query reference property are not present. So this is basically a bad query, because there was a typo in it here, and there is still a typo in here. And this is how you get it. So this is how you fix your queries, and you get the data and you modify. So as a best practice, because if you start retrieving data in the full data set, your request and responses will become large, obviously, because you are dealing with all the data of a particular entity. But if you use filtering like this, only fetching the data that you require to work with, it makes it more efficient. So your query does not need to run long, it will give you small responses, which means small processing power and everything. So Atos recently started this decarbonization thing. So these are the things that you need to look into when you are developing your script. So it does not use as much resource. But as I said, like, Graph Explorer is a good tool to start with your learning with graph basically. But it has the same problems that we have with the portals. Like, here you can see I cannot run multiple queries. Like, this query is done, then okay, but I cannot use the output of this query to use as an input to the next query. I cannot use Graph Explorer to programmatically make the Graph API calls. This is a sandbox. This is good for single queries and for your test cases to test whether your query is working or not, whether it is giving any errors or not. If you really want to work with Microsoft Graph API, then you would be developing an application with any programming that you are comfortable with. There are SDKs out there, or the PowerShell that we mostly work with. So we have seen something like this, where we are fetching a data. Let's see how we can maybe create a user. So that will be a post call is required to create a user. So we will be doing that, but when we are doing a post call, we have to define a request body. A request body is nothing but where we have to define the parameter values with which the user entity will be created with, right? So if I just run this query here, it will give me a error saying that empty payload JSON content expected, means you cannot create a user blankly without providing any data. So you need to create a JSON body, and let me quickly get the body here. You can construct that on your own. So this is how a body will look like when you define it in the JSON thing. Account enabled equals to true. I don't need to define all the parameters of the user entity type. I need to define only the parameters that are required to create a user entity type. And to know this, so you will have to read the Graph API documentation. The documentation, so for example, Graph API users. If I go into this documentation, you see create user. This is it will tell you you need to read the documentation for the resource type you are working with. So the request body should be like this, and these are only the required parameters. Rest of the things I don't need to define. So the same thing I am doing that here. Let's run this query. So this returns an error because I was testing, and it says that another object with the same value for the property user principal name already exists. So maybe something like this. If I run this, then it will give me a good response like created 201 with the user body that is created now provided in the response. So you see this is the user that is created. And same way like we did to actually confirm the user is created, you can again run a get query with that graph dot user one, and you can run the query and you get a HTTP OK 200 response, means the user really exists. So you created one user using Graph API. So that is how you do it. And say for example, now if I want to this user, particular user, this user, if I see the country is set to null, I want to update this, then I don't need to update the other entity parameters. I will only update that particular parameter. I can do that with patch. So if I put a patch, again I have to define a body, a JSON body that is like this, where I have to mention country, say India, and I run this query. It will give me the no content 204. This is a HTTP response, good response. And now if I have to check whether that particular property has been updated or not, I can do it using the same dollar select filtering. Uh, and change the HTTP method to get and run the query, and I see the country has been updated. So it's not null again. So this is how you run the queries here, and this was all about how you use Graph Explorer as the tool. But again, as I told you, it's only for testing purposes only. It's of real no use when we talk about automation. Uh, so we have seen get, we have seen post, we have seen patch. Put is something that is not used that much, so there is no real value in this particular method. And the last thing that is there is delete. So if you want to delete this user, you just go ahead and simply run this with the delete method and the user will be deleted. So it's a HTTP OK response. Now if you try to run a get query, you will see that the resource does not exist. so the user has been deleted. So same, let me do it for the other user as well, because that was a test user, and done. And that is all we were looking into the Graph Explorer site. Now next part of this is when we will start with using PowerShell. So first let's get back to the slideshow again, and the live demo for the Graph Explorer we already talked about. Now, the important thing is that here in Graph Explorer, when we were using that, and I showed you about the access token things, the authentication part is taken care of by the tool itself. I do not have any role in that. But when I will be doing that using a program that I am coding or a PowerShell script that I am writing, I will have to take care of the authentication part. Now, most of the thing like this is when we do, you will say, why do we need to do that? Because we use the connect MS graph and all these things, and that is how we do it. But like to be honest, like connect MS graph or those CM deletes that you do, that is good for a few test cases. But when you are running in production environment, you need to have your own authentication code, because you need to know how it is implemented, because not every scenario you will be able to use the connect ms graph thing. So that is where we need to know about two particular msl flows, the Microsoft authentication library authentication flows. There are actually many, so 5 or 6 authentication flows are there, of which I will be showing only two, because those are the two most common flows that are used. This is the authorization code auth flow, and this is used with the delegated permission type because it requires a user sign in. Sorry for that. So what happens is user starts to access the app. The app will request for a sign in. The sign in request is sent to the authentication endpoint with the resource scope and the client ID. The authentication endpoint will validate that request, and if the request is like validated good, then the application receives an authorization code. This authorization code can be used by the application to request an access token, and the access finally the access token is issued to the application, which the application can now use to access the resource, that is the Microsoft Graph. So this authentication flow is delegated permission type because it requires a user sign in, and these are all the steps that are involved. Now there is one more authentication flow, which is the client credential authentication flow. This does not require a user sign in, so this is a fully automated scenario where the application does not require a user to be present. The application prepares the authentication request using its own identity. So the application will have its own identity like client app ID and its own secret. And it will send the request to the authentication endpoint. The authentication endpoint will validate if the application request is valid or not. And it will directly issue the access token with which it can go ahead and access the resource and get the response back. Now, these two, both the authentication flows that I talked about, both the authentication flow talks about a particular thing, that is a client ID. Because Microsoft Authentication Library also forms the base for conditional access, client ID is important. So when I am sending a request, say for example, I am signing in with my mobile with an application, the authentication request that is being sent to Microsoft Identity Platform does not only defines that I am the user who is signing in, but it also defines this is the application with which the user is signing in, to check if the application is allowed or not. And also the authentication request also contains the details. This is the device from where the user is signing in, if there is a device based conditional access as well. So the things like this needs to be kept in mind. However, when we work with PowerShell, uh, this is how the code looks like basically. So there is a definite region where you define your authentication code. So here don't look into the code here now, just look into the structure. So this is how there will be an authentication code in the front of the application, and then the next part, which will obviously contain the actual Graph API query. So these are the two basic parts that you can divide your PowerShell script into. If you are into programming, it will be almost similar, whatever development environment you are doing it. So if I look into that, I think the next is a live demo for the PowerShell thing. So I will be showing that using Visual Studio. So let's look into the auth code, the first flow that we were talking about, that is authentication code flow. Okay, so before we first get started into in here, let's go back to the Azure portal, because there you need to perform certain actions before you are even able to do that. Run your PowerShell scripts or things like that. So what you would need to do is come into the Azure portal. From Azure portal, you need to go into app registration, where you need to register an application using the new registration form. So here I have this created for the PowerShell. So basically what it gives me is this application ID, means this application is now registered with Microsoft Azure AD to be able to use the Microsoft authentication platform to sign in. Um, the directory ID is required, like in cases, but the important thing is this. And the next important thing is the API permissions, where you grant the permissions to the applications. So here you can click on add a permission, uh, choose Microsoft Graph or whatever resource type your code will be working with. But you don't need to choose any of these individual, because if you are using Microsoft Graph, means basically you have access to all of this. So you don't need to use the individual APIs. And then the same thing, the delegated permission or the application permission that you are working with, and then you choose and add it. So once you add it here, it will come in here, but the status will not be like this. Now you are seeing this as green. This status only comes up as green when the admin grants the consent to the permission. Otherwise it won't work. And the other important thing that you need to work on here is the certificates and secrets. So this is how you generate a client secret. So a client secret, you can say like a password only, what we have with our account. So the app ID or the client ID becomes the application username, and this is the application password with which the application signs in. And this is required only in case where the application is working without a signed in user. This is not that secured, because obviously you have to provide this value in the script. As you can look in here, um, you are defining it here. Now there are ways to make it secure in PowerShell as well, but anyways, anything that you are hard coding into the script cannot be secured because it can be broken. So maybe you can use a Azure Key Vault as well to do that. But the most secure thing is getting it done using a certificate. So you can also create a self-signed certificate, upload it to Azure AD for that particular application, and use the certificate to authenticate with the service. And once you are done with that, you are good to go and create your authentication code in here. So basically, this is the auth code, where first we all start with defining the variables. So this is my client ID, client secret, the resource that I would be working with, that is graph.microsoft.com. Scope is the permission. I am using the default scope, means whatever permissions are added to the applications are applicable for the sign in. And a redirect URI. Redirect URI is like a URL where the authentication response will be sent back to. This you do not need like a resolvable URL to be put in here. It does not request that. And once you do that, this is basically the code that is there. So you are sending a request to login.microsoftonline.com with all the parameters that are already defined. And what you get in response is an authentication code, the auth code, where I'm storing it in this variable. And using this authentication code, then I will be getting a token response, which will contain my access token. So if I run this particular script, you will see uh, it pops up a sign in window. I'm already signed in, but I can still click on that. So it will ask me to consent for the permissions. And once that is done, I will have a token response back, means JWT token sent back to this application. So you see, this is the response for that, because I'm displaying this variable again. So you get the response, otherwise it's a silent code. So you get these details where you have a access token, you have a refresh token, and you have a ID token. ID token only comes in the scenario where there is a user sign in. If it is an application signing using a client secret or a client certificate authentication, there is no ID token, because ID token basically for belongs to a user. If you only want to see the access token, you can do that as well from here. You don't need to copy this and go into a browser to check that. There is a module for that. So import module, you can do that with JWT details. Once the module is imported, you can just take. So I have what um, token response dot access token JWT details. If I see this, so this is my access token, the current access token that I just retrieved, and you get the details of everything. So here also you can see what all permissions are there. And once you have the access token, it is very easy to create something. So for example, if I want to now use a get user, like working with that, I can do that using this. So for example, a fetching data for a user, if I do that, I just have to use this access token into this thing as a authorization header, and I can construct a API. So basically, this is how you are constructing whatever you did in Graph Explorer. You are doing this as same, and you are invoking a REST method to call that particular thing. So this is how, and the response will be stored in this variable. And then you can use PowerShell to do like save the data to a CSV and all those things. So if I run this now, basically, it will ask me to enter the user UPN for which you want to, oh sorry, for which you would want to retrieve data for. File path to save, and file name to save, obviously maybe user.csv. I can do that. And now if I just do a cd c/temp, and if I do a dir, I can see that the CSV is saved. Now if you go into that, you can also see the value that was there. uh, and this is how the data is getting stored on the CSV. So you get all the data. Now it has contained the type information, so you can run this particular query when you are saving to a CSV. You can use the no type information. parameter as well, so to have a clean CSV. So similarly, you can use PowerShell like looping things and all those other things that you are doing with this to make use of it programmatically. So maybe you are fetching the data, you can use this CSV now as an input to a next command or a query that you are doing, and you can do all those automations and kind of things like that. So that was with the authorization code auth flow, and this is how a client ID secret. So this is the most simple authentication flow to implement in PowerShell. You define the variables for the script first, which is the tenant name, the client ID, the client secret. Now here it is important, like you have to define a tenant name or a tenant ID, because when we are signing in with a user, the UPN is there at the rate whatever domain it is for the application to determine which tenant it is signing into. But when you are signing with a application only, there is no user involved. There is no way that the authentication platform would be able to determine to which tenant this particular application is trying to sign into if you don't define it in the code. So that is why you have to define your tenant name and the things, and basically then a request for the same. So the body is constructed using the grant type client credentials with the scope is this, client ID is again this, client secret is this, all that was defined, and just invoking the REST method. It's a post method. And that is also currently I have a access token here, so I would need to clear the cache before I would be able to use this code again. I won't be showing that, but this is how you do this. However, for example, if you do not want to use or code everything, you can also use the msal.ps PowerShell module and use this get msal token command. This function will be already there in the module. You can just import the module like I did the import module jwt details. Similarly, you can just import this module, use the function that is built in there, and provide the parameters like shown here, and you will get the authentication token there, the access token, the same thing. So this is how you can do this. And if like any one of you have the interest to actually look into this, so when you do this like connect.ms graph, when you are working with this, or connect dot azure ad, they are also implementing the same authentication flow. Now you would be asking, like in this case I only sign in with my user, I don't define a client ID and all those things, so where they are getting that? So this particular modules that are already available in the PowerShell gallery uses a well-known client ID that can authenticate to any of the tenants of Microsoft. So they mostly use the all zero identifiers to get into the tenants. But in those cases, you cannot use this for a full automation case. You have to implement something of your own like this, whether you do it with a get msal token or you do it using the code of your own. And so that would be all. Now if anyone have any questions for me, then I would be happy to answer.
Just sorry, but probably I missed the part. But what about the PKI integration? How that works with this Graph API?
PKI integration in the sense of the certificate based
Based
authentication that I told.
authentications, yes.
So that is also you have to generate a self-signed certificate. So there is a code for that. You can take it. So these codes are nothing that are created by me. Like you see this in my Visual Studio, don't think that I have created this. These are already available in the internet, But yes, you cannot use them as it is. You have to derive it for your own use case. You have to modify places. When you run this script, particular script, it will generate a self sign certificate which will be stored in the same ctemp folder. You see the certificate. This is created as a self sign certificate for my tenant, which I can use. The same certificate is uploaded in Azure here. Obviously, the thumbprint will be different because I generated a new one. So you can just delete this one, upload a new one. And once you have the certificate uploaded here, there is the certificate based authentication auth code. This is the CC secret. This is the certificate. Yes. So this is where you need to modify it. So you will have to open this again, get the thumbprint of the certificate, which is this, and paste it in here in the code, and you are good to go. So you run this code and you will get the same access token. But then this particular path is this code is more difficult. So it is creating many things. So it is creating a JWT. So first we won't pass the certificate directly, right? So it is creating a base 64 hash of the certificate. Then it is creating a timestamp for the header. It is creating the validity. It is creating the header file, and then it is creating the payload. And after the payload, it is again converting it to base 64 for security. And after all those cryptography, it is doing this, the particular thing that we are doing for everything. It's a client credential auth flow, and I'm sending the request to login.microsoftonline.com with the certificate attached to get a token, and the token will be of same type. Mm, let's see, let's run this. So, yep, you got a token here if you see. So to, and there is no ID type here, as I said, because this is without sign in. So it didn't ask me a user sign in, right? Similarly, if you want to see the token, this is the token. ID type is app. See, this is not a user.
Mm, okay.
And these are the permissions that are assigned. And once you have the token response, uh, not the token response basically, once you have the access token, um, you can use that access token to use Microsoft Graph in whatever way you like. The only thing that you need to do is like know the structure of how to construct a Graph API call. Now the structure is simple. You just need a header. You need to define a header. The header always contains the token type bearer with your access token, because that is what you are authenticating with. And then you create the URI. No, so here you see that I am defining variables and first storing them inside. This is just because so that my whatever I am invoking, the HTTP call looks clean. I can do it like this way as well. If I do it this way, I don't use that and I use this, you will see the line will get increased. And like, this is for example purpose I'm showing with user. The real use cases, the queries get much longer. So more longer the queries, the more longer that you have, it will be word wrapped or things like that, and it will be difficult for troubleshooting. So it's always best practice to define it in variables and use that. But again, do not define much variables because that also uses the resources, right? It's basically using the computing resource. So that is how it is. So this is this is all about Graph API, how you use it. Okay, so one thing, like in Graph Explorer, I showed you how you create a body, JSON body, but in here, like when you are doing it from PowerShell, how would you define a post call? So to do that, this is how you define the body, a JSON body. So whatever you need to do, if I have to write it in here, say basically, let me remove this. So whatever will be the JSON content that you derive from the Graph API documentation, you have to put it in between these two marks. Now, if you want to pass variables in your body, then you would have to do it like this. Instead of the single inverted comma, you have to do the double inverted comma. Then you would be able to pass variables. The difference is, let me show. So like this is a good way, because this is only a JSON body. I don't need anything else. But say for example, if display name is equals to graph user there, where I pass it a variable like here $user, where I define $user in here, like say for example, you are getting the user from a CSV file, import CSV for each object, you are saving it as a user, and you are running the query, then you would be doing this, whatever the code be in here, and you pass that particular variable in here, then you would need to do the double inverted comma, not the single inverted comma. This is the only thing that you need to take care of, and you will be done. So any further questions or from anyone?
Hey, Joy, this is Vivek. I had a question. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
couple of questions. One was about access token. So
Mm-hmm.
access token is more of is actually an authorization token, and then you have ID, which is authentication token, and then of course you have refresh, which is gonna get the access token back again, right? So I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about specific scenario where we are using only delegated permissions and not application permissions, wherein user has to re-authenticate.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, does refresh token have the capacity to generate ID token as well, or only access, the authorization part?
So when you are like with a delegated permission, when you are doing an authentication,
Mhm.
until and unless anything changes with the user sign in parameters, like the password changes or something like that, the user won't be asked to do a interactive sign in again, because the refresh token is capable to do a silent authentication in the backend. But only when the password of the user changes, or maybe you are modifying any parameters of the user account, then the refresh token won't be able to do a silent sign in, and it will fall back to a interactive sign in.
Okay, okay. I was talking. I was basically asking that in the context of the keep alive, wherein we have a session cookie that's going to
Mm-hmm.
be live only for certain time, and then a user gets to authenticate again. Um, so in certain situations, user will be re-authenticated. So
Mm-hmm.
as long as we have a keep alive setting. So okay, yeah, I think you answered that. I had another question about the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So good that you mentioned that we'll probably have to use tenant ID. Programmatically, we can use that.
Mm-hmm.
But my question was about Graph Explorer. If you
Mm-hmm.
sign in with a UPN, of
Mm-hmm.
course, that can be your global admin account.
Mm-hmm.
Let's, for example, you have access to three tenants under
Mm-hmm.
one subscription, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Graph Explorer by default connects to one tenant, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're using Explorer and not PowerShell or any other method,
Mm-hmm.
how does it know which tenant to connect to by default, or does it pick the primary one or something like that? Because as far as I know, I mean, I had three tenants in one, I mean, three working directories in one with one username, and I tried to sign in, and it just signed into one without telling me
So
how it is.
basically, what happens is when you are working with Graph, say for Graph Explorer,
Uh,
the highest permission for anything, it can be with PowerShell as well. The highest permission that you can assign to a Graph API is this permission that is there. Wait. Device directory. Directory read write all. This is the highest permission that you can do. So by default, it connects to a single directory. If your tenant is within that directory, the UPN, which is the primary directory, it will connect to that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. My question was if we had multiple directories, which is multiple tenants.
Then Graph Explorer do not have a way. But if you are defining a application like this and using with PowerShell, you have the option to wait. When you okay, wait. When you register an application, you have the option whether this directory only or any organizational directory, which is a multi-tenant.
Okay. Okay. This is good. So if at all we use this app ID and respective client secret or certificate, we can connect to multiple tenants as well.
Yes, so you
Okay.
have that option only for like when you are developing your own app or script. Graph Explorer by default won't do that. Graph Explorer is tied to your primary directory, and this is the highest permission that you can apply to. If you
Okay.
give directory read write all, then you don't need any other permission basically, because you have given the permission to the entire directory.
Okay. That would answer my question. Thanks.
Yep. If there are no further questions, then I think we are good to go. So this was me, Joy. I am a Microsoft MVP. I am a senior consultant architect for working in the digital workplace of Atos ESO team. Now it's practice. I don't remember what practice it is. And that's basically me. So thank you all for connecting. And I hope this was like the time you spent out of the busy schedule was justified enough by the session that we had. And hope to have you in some other presentations of mine in the future as well.
Quite helpful. Thank you, Joy.
Yeah.
Thank you.